Okay, well, welcome to Human Biology Digestion Online Lecture, Part 2. I actually tried this last evening, recorded the whole lecture, and used a remote microphone that apparently was malfunctioning. So here's a second attempt at it, folks. We'll see how this goes. So we're on the digestive tract and digestive system. We've covered the oral cavity and the esophagus. We talked about the esophagus needing to go through the diaphragm, and some problems with that, such as acid reflux disease or gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD, where stomach juice gets pushed back up into the esophagus and wears away at it, burns at it, attempting to digest it because, well, unlike the stomach, the esophagus doesn't have the same protection that the stomach does against the stomach acids, and so it can be a problem. Some of you know, acid reflux is no fun. We also talked about what can happen when portions of the stomach actually pushes back up through that hole, if you will, in the diaphragm that the esophagus passes through, and then you end up getting some of the stomach up here above the diaphragm, and that's called a hiatal hernia. And we finished off talking about how much food the stomach can hold and the environment of the stomach, just a brief introduction to that. We talked about the stomach being able to hold 1 to 4 liters of food, and then if you remember, we watched Kobayashi versus the Chicago 5, I believe it was, and his ability, Kobayashi's ability to eat food, incredible volumes of food, even though he's not a real large person. It's just, you know, something he's probably maybe he had a little bit of a genetic predisposition towards that, but I suspect largely it's because he has worked at expanding his stomach. And in just a second here, I'll show you how that's possible. And then also, we talked about the stomach environment being very acidic, and we messed a little bit with that in some previous labs where we acidified things, and we're actually going to do that, well, today. I'm recording this Thursday morning, so we'll be doing that again today as well. Okay, so brief overview of the digestive tract where we're at right now. I'm going to switch to another slide here. And this is a slide of the stomach itself and some aspects of it. And so here we have the stomach, and there's a number of things unique, of course, about the stomach. Well, of course, first we want to point out the presence of sphincters. This one's called here the lower gastroesophageal sphincter. We're just calling it the cardiac sphincter because it's close to the heart. And then the pyloric sphincter down here. Pylorus means gatekeeper or gate guard in Greek, I believe. And basically they're just circular bands of muscle that stay contracted most of the time to hold food in the stomach and juices, digestive juices in the stomach, and separate the stomach, the environment in the stomach, from the environment in the small intestine and from the environment in the esophagus. We've already talked about the importance of that. When you have stomach juices getting up into the esophagus, it's not a pleasant thing. They don't belong there. So if we look at the stomach then in cross-section, the muscularis, remember those 4 layers of the digestive tract, you know, the serosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, mucosa, all those layers of the stomach. If you look at just the muscularis layer in the stomach, we see an additional 3rd layer. Most of the digestive tract has these longitudinal fibers and these circular fibers, but in the stomach we see an additional oblique layer, kind of running at angles across. And that's because the stomach has the additional job of mechanically breaking down food. Most of the rest of the digestive tract depends on a chemical means of breaking down the food, but the stomach, it's happening mechanically. We talked earlier about how when it's time for you to eat, oftentimes you can feel your stomach rumble. Well, the rumble is those muscles sort of warming up in anticipation of receiving food. And when food gets into the stomach then, of course, there's a chemical breakdown. There's the acidic environment and the enzymes we'll talk about in a minute. But there's also that muscular layer going to work, churning the food, mixing it, and mechanically breaking it down. So important to note that in the stomach, food is both mechanically, by the muscle layers, and chemically broken down. Well, if we look then at the lining of the stomach, this would be an artist's rendition of a close-up of that. It's not real smooth. In fact, first of all, if we look here, you can see those folds, those ridges and valleys in the stomach. Those are called rouge, and those are what will expand, allow the stomach to expand. The wrinkles will go away, the stomach will expand, and allow it to hold a lot more food than would be the case if it were only the size that exists when it's empty inside our abdominal cavity. So those are the folds that expand and allow people like Kobayashi to eat an incredible volume of food at one time. Some critters have an esophageal pouch here called a crop. And then there's ruminant animals that will, like cows, that will eat a lot and then barf it up later to chew it and then swallow it completely, or leeches that have a big crop that are able to eat a lot of blood and then later digest it. So when there are opportunities for a meal come, they take advantage of it. Well, in our stomach, we know it's a very acidic environment, and there is these layers we've talked about, and if we look close up at those layers, we see a surface that is not just flat, but there's sort of a subtle smoothness to it with some holes in it, some pits, if you will, in it, and it's from those pits that we get the enzyme the enzyme pepsin excreted to help break down food. Okay, so we're going to wonder where pepsin comes from, and before we get to that, though, there's sort of another feature of the stomach I wanted to mention. And when you think about the stomach, you just think about digestion, but in actuality, there's other things that go on. There is a few things that get absorbed into your digestive tract through the stomach. It does mostly digestion, but there's a little bit of absorption that goes on. And now remember, this whole digestive tract doesn't just exist like separate entities in your abdominal cavity. It's surrounded by blood vessels. There will be blood vessels all around this. And your body is able to absorb out of the stomach water. So when you take a big drink of water, you don't have to wait for it to go all the way through your stomach into your small intestine, about 4 hours. You can get it into your bloodstream much quicker, which is the goal, to get that fluid into your bloodstream. Also, some drugs like aspirin and alcohol will be absorbed into your bloodstream in the stomach, and so in the case if you got a headache, what a wonderful thing for you take that aspirin or ibuprofen or Tylenol, whatever, and it gets into your bloodstream quickly, so it can address that headache, and so that's a good thing. So yeah, more than just digestion, a little more. Salt also gets absorbed into your system in the stomach. Now, if we look at the stomach, if you remember back, there were 4 types of tissues, and one of them in particular I said sort of lines surfaces, and that is an epithelial tissue. And so if we think about the internal surface of the stomach, you would want it to be lined with something, and it's going to be lined with epithelium. We call this particular kind of epithelium columnar epithelium because, like the name might imply, it's columnar. It's long, thinner pieces of, or long, thin cells. And so the pink stuff here, the pinkish purple stuff here, this is lining the inside of your stomach. Those would be described as columnar epithelium. Columnar just indicating the shape, epithelium telling us that it's covering the inside of the stomach. So we find them there. And of course these gastric pits, which are openings to gastric glands down in here. Okay? So these pits are little holes in the lining of the stomach, and it's from those holes that materials come, substances come that are important to the digestive process, and that's what we want to sort of key on right here. Now when I talk about these, I'm going to talk about them individually and where they tend to be found in the stomach, but remember they work together, and that'll come through. The first one we're going to talk about, the first type of cell found down in these gastric glands are goblet cells. And goblet cells produce mucus. And mucus, I know it's not a pleasant thing, but it's a wonderful thing when it's working. And we find largely those goblet cells up here in the cardiac region of the stomach. Now that's not to say they don't exist down here in the pyloric region. They do, but there's more of them up here in the cardiac region. They're producing mucus, and that mucus then comes out here and flows down the inside of the stomach and coats and protects it. And so, you know, there has to be some down here, or, you know, you couldn't stand on your head for long periods of time. Your stomach would start digesting itself, and it doesn't do that, so normally. So yeah, there's lots of them up here in the cardiac region. And that's a good thing, because gravity then just takes that mucus and it just flows down over the inside of the stomach, coats it, and protects the epithelial cells, those columnar epithelium, from being digested by the corrosive digestive environment that is the stomach. So that's the first of the 3 cells we find in these gastric glands. The second one is called parietal cell, and it is the parietal cells that secrete hydrochloric acid. That's the acid we've been using in lab. That's what's in your stomach, and you've actually got cells that'll take hydrogen chloride, put it together to make hydrochloric acid, and they're produced in the gastric glands. And then lastly, there's a cell called a chief cell. Now, both parietal cells and chief cells tend to be found lower in the stomach, in the pyloric region. But again, there would be some up here in the top part as well, just mostly they're down here. So the chief cell's job is to produce sort of a pre-enzyme called pepsinogen. Now remember that ogen on the end of it. So the enzyme is pepsin, but pepsinogen is sort of an inactive precursor molecule to it. It won't digest anything, but with a little transformation it can be turned into an enzyme that will. We're going to see that again with other molecules like fibrin and fibrinogen when we get to the blood. And it's a good thing that your body makes these inactive pre-enzymes or pre-proteins that aren't quite ready to do a job, but on short notice they can. And so the chief cells produce pepsinogen, and pepsinogen, when it gets dumped into the stomach in that acidic environment created by the parietal cells and the hydrochloric acid they produce, the hydrochloric acid, a good image to have would be snips off an end of the pepsinogen molecule, turns it into pepsin, and makes it able to do digestion, to digest proteins. That's pepsin's job, to digest proteins in an acidic environment. That's where it likes to work. Now, as you might guess, we don't want the stomach digesting all the time, churning and pumping out hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen all the time. That would be inefficient. So your body has stop and start buttons, if you will, that turn it on, turn it off. All over the body these exist. You're really well made to conserve resources. That would be wasteful, it would be problematic for your body, a lot of protection that would need it if your stomach was trying to digest stuff all the time. And so your body has sensors in it, a number of them right up here, 2 types actually. One that senses stretch, so when this sphincter stretches, when food goes through it, when peristalsis forces food through that sphincter, there are stretch receptors that sense that that's been done. And then there are also sensors that detect the presence of proteins. They're a very general receptor, but those 2 things cause your body to produce a hormone called gastrin. Now, gastrin is produced by the stomach, but it's dumped into the bloodstream. If you look down here at the sort of the basement cells here to the inner layer of the stomach, you can see the blood vessels there. So gastrin is produced and dumped into the bloodstream. It travels all around the body and comes back to the stomach. Now, it's kind of a cool thing. That gastrin release triggers the release of a little hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. Okay, so when that happens, you get a little of the digestion, kind of starts things up, gets the body ready. So, but gastrin then, when it travels all the way around the body, takes a minute or 2 to allow the stomach to warm up, if you will. When it comes back to the stomach and is sensed by the stomach, kind of cool, the stomach produces gastrin, it has a little effect, gets into the bloodstream, goes back to the stomach, gets sensed by the stomach, has a big effect. It's kind of a delayed switch, if you will. When it gets back to the stomach, it turns the stomach on full force, dumps lots of hydrochloric acid, lots of pepsinogen that's converted to pepsin into the system, and the digestive process gets going full force. So, just to recap, a protein bolus, chewed food, enters the stomach, and that triggers the release of a little hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen, and also triggers the release of gastrin, and gastrin goes into the bloodstream, travels around the stomach while your stomach warms up, comes back to the stomach, is sensed by the stomach, and in turn then the stomach produces lots of hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen and does all the digestion that we're familiar with. So it's kind of a cool process, and as you can guess, there's lots of detail that would be possible. I want to show you just a little picture from your textbook that illustrates that. So here you have the stomach, and you swallow some food, and it contains protein, and stretch receptors and protein receptors sense that here, and that produces gastrin, a little gastrin, and it also produces, well, I should say, it produces hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen, which your stomach senses, and then produces gastrin. Gastrin goes into the bloodstream, back to the stomach. The stomach, in response to that, produces lots of hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen, and the digestion process goes. We'll talk about some of these other hormones next time, but I wanted to start with gastrin because it's the on switch for your stomach. But then if there's an on switch, there probably has to be an off switch, and we'll get to that next time. I wanted to just finish up by highlighting a couple of individuals in history that were big contributors to our knowledge of the digestive system. And one is a gentleman by the name of Alexis St. Martin, and that's him right here. He is an interesting individual. He's born in late 1700s, early 1800s, and he was a French-Canadian fur trader. And didn't speak English really, but he was standing outside the company store on Mackinac Island up in northern Michigan. This is, I think, June of 1822, as a young man. And there was a guy standing next to him holding a double-barrel shotgun loaded for ducks. Guys duck hunting in June. You know, that's not allowed now, but back in 1722 they weren't so worried about it, I guess. So anyway, Alexis San Martin is standing here. Guy standing next to him holding a double-barrel shotgun, and kind of cradled in his arm like this, and it accidentally goes off, and it hits San Martin in the left side of his chest, and upper abdomen, lower chest. You can imagine, 2 feet away, double-barrel shotgun, both barrels go off. It blew away a big chunk of his side, ribs sticking out, lung coming out. It perforated the stomach, and breakfast food is coming out. It's just a nasty scene. It's so bad his clothing even catches on fire. It's so close to the gun they have to put his clothing out, if you can imagine that. Well, they figure the guy's dead. But dutifully, they bind his wounds best they can, cart him away, and a doctor by the name of William Beaumont takes over and sort of nurses St. Martin back to health. But that hole in his stomach actually fused, if you will, to the side of his abdominal cavity wall, and created what's called a permanent gastric fistula, a window, if you will, into his stomach. Now, it would be bad if it didn't merge with the body wall, because then stomach contents would come out of the stomach and fall into the abdominal cavity. So it's a really good thing that it merged with the exterior wall of the abdomen that prevented that from happening. But he had to put a plug in there the rest of his life to keep breakfast food from coming out, or dinner food, or supper food, whatever. So yeah, Beaumont figured this was a unique opportunity. Now he's got a window to the human digestive tract, and he kind of, some say, conned St. Martin into signing a 10-year contract to allow him to sort of experiment on him. He would put different kinds of foods on a string and stick it down in there and pull them back out and see how they were digested. He could look in the stomach and see the rouge and the different aspects of the interior of the stomach, and did that for 10 years while St. Martin was basically his personal servant. But eventually that association ended. Beaumont died, I think he slipped on the steps and hit his head and died fairly early. But St. Martin lived to be an older man. I think he died late 70s, maybe 80 years old. Unfortunately, he was a bit of an alcoholic later in life, which might explain this picture. He seems to be maybe 2.5 sheets to the wind. He's got a nice smile there, I don't know. But the lady standing next to him, she does not seem to be a happy woman. That's his wife. I don't know. But anyway, earlier in life, then, if we look at St. Martin's chest, you can see where the wound was. It was right here, and that is trying to represent the opening that Beaumont used to learn about the digestive tract in humans. I believe your textbook references St. Martin a bit. I thought I'd give you a little bit of the rest of the story. Another individual that I want to finish up with is a guy by the name of Dr. Barry Marshall. Actually, Robert Warren and Barry Marshall. And I have a picture of them too. This is Barry Marshall. This is Robert Warren. Robert Warren is a pathologist. Marshall was basically an intern at this time, middle 70s, and this is in Perth, Australia. And so at the time, Warren recognized that in ulcer patient sufferers, there was this population of bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. Pylori, like pyloric region of the stomach, and so they just call it H. pylori. And he told Marshall that, and Marshall sort of took that and ran, and started looking for it in patients and thinking about it a lot, doing some preliminary testing, and finally came up with an idea that he became convinced that it was H. pylori that was creating ulcers. Not the standard, oh, you lead too stressful a life, you drink too much coffee, those sort of things, which I bet if I asked the class what causes an ulcer, I'd get a fair number of responses of that sort. So Marshall's thinking that that's not the case, that it might be this bacteria, and does some preliminary testing, but he kind of runs up against a wall. It's hard to culture this bacteria in the lab. The only way they figured it out is they accidentally left a culture plate in an incubator for like 6 weeks instead of 2, and then it showed up. So that was an accident. But then they tried to put it inside test animals to make it cause ulcers, and it never did. It just didn't live inside guinea pigs and rats and things of that sort. So all he was left with was to try to test it on humans, but you can't test for stuff like that on humans. Well, you can if you do it on yourself, and so that's what he did, and then there was another volunteer in his lab that did that. And so collectively they sit down one day and they got this beef broth, nasty beef broth, full of this bacteria, and they chug it. I can't imagine it, but they do. And sure enough, they a few days, weeks later, they developed problematic gastritis. They never developed an ulcer, truly an ulcer, but there were problems. They were able to figure out that the bacteria did live in the stomach environment, as difficult as that is to believe. Yep, bacteria can live there. This kind of bacteria can live there. And actually went on to prove that H. pylori is responsible for probably about 70% of ulcers. And that's why in this day and age, ulcers are treated primarily with antibiotics, and then secondarily with things that reduce stomach activity and acidity and things like that. Still, stress and too much coffee, whatever, can contribute, even cause some ulcers, but most of them are caused by H. pylori. And his story is in your textbook. I think page 13 gives a little more detail on this, and it's one of the required readings, so make sure you look for that. This is Barry Marshall now. He's aged just a little bit, but he actually won the Nobel Prize for those efforts. So hopefully you find that interesting. That's about where I wanted to finish off. We'll start with the small intestine on Monday, and hopefully this all works out and you have a good weekend, and I will see you for lab on Thursday today. Thank you.